Jay here. We're out here with the 2021 FC350. I like 350s. Enjoying those bikes. Got this one from Swap Moto Live. Borrowed it. Right now we're going to switch to some footage from yesterday with the WP guys where we talk about the suspension of this bike and we'll report back. Hey, Jay here. Today we're going to talk about the 2021 KTM / Husqvarna suspension updates. And for 21, they got some substantial updates to the AER fork, and KTM still is now the only manufacturer with an AER fork. And we've liked this AER 48 fork, but we've also liked testing other stuff, cone valve, KYB conversion. We've run some of that other stuff. They're more expensive options, but I've heard good things about this stuff, and we're going to test a bike out tomorrow at the track, a 21 350 with this new stuff. And so Lee's going to give us some information. I want to really show why and what's, because we can always say it's all updated, but it's supposed to be substantial updates. So we're going to get in here with Lee right now and look at these. We have a 20 and 21 stuff tore apart where he can show us exactly what's different. There's some semi-major updates to this stuff, and we can talk about it right now. All right, so here Lee is going to lay out what's different right now on these 21 forks. Here we go. Take it over, Lee.
Okay, so on both fork legs, there's actually a fairly significant change to the outer tube. If you have a look in here, and I'll hold it up for the camera, there's actually notches at the bushing seat. And the concept there is that as the fork compresses and rebounds, you have a bushing that is actually seated on that surface, and then another one on the chrome tube. And the space between them, or that chamber, is constantly growing and shrinking as you compress and rebound the fork. That creates an opportunity for some unintentional dampening or spring action that is basically just about the hardware itself. So in order to eliminate any possibility of creating unintentional forces there, we've actually notched that in 3 places so that any air and oil that's in that cavity can travel back and forth between that chamber and the rest of the outer fork chamber without any creating any unnecessary or unintentional forces. So that's a big change and that's on both fork legs. And there's a few other changes in the internal construction that aren't performance related. They're just updates that are for other reasons in terms of manufacturing and just improvements there. So that's the big change on both outer tubes.
Now, as far as performance, by those changes, we understand what it's accomplishing, but what would somebody feel different just from that change?
So basically, in back-to-back testing on the track, it just smooths out the operation, and so all the efforts that have been made to improve the spring fork, the air fork, are basically, this is now a number of years into production, and we're trying to optimize everything we can in the fork. So small things like this, which are relatively small changes in real life, but it was able to be felt by test riders on the track, and so they incorporated it into the new forks. So switching from the outer tubes to the internal workings of the fork, right here I actually have laid out an air cartridge. This one on the left here is going to be your Model Year 20 type air cartridge, and the big change that you'll notice is this notch. We call it the bypass, and this is actually when the fork's topped out at the very top of the stroke, the piston actually sits right here, and this is when you're filling your air, it's actually filling both of these chambers, and it's achieving that by bypassing the piston seal to do that. Now, by lengthening that, it's lengthened it all the way into the compression stroke. So what is happening is we're actually making the transition from the chambers being essentially one to shutting off, and then once this piston reaches this point, the compression chamber will start to increase compression, the positive chamber will start to increase pressure, while the negative chamber will transition to being in vacuum. So by making that longer, what you're doing is you're making that early part of the stroke just a little bit smoother. There's some other changes inside with spaces and things along those lines, but those are all to achieve the same goal, which is to smooth out that initial action of the air cartridge.
Now, one of the things that slow, short, chubby vet guys do, probably me, is I call them slap landings.
Yes.
Okay, you land, because I don't like landing on the front wheel and dying. Okay, so you land, and you don't have the skills in the air to land it just right all the time. So you land with the rear wheel and then slap that front AER.
Yep.
And so on both those changes, we'll get into the other one. Does that help on some of that? Because that was the harshness I would feel with the air fork previous.
So I would actually say that this probably is contributing part of that. The other area where you're going to get improvement in the new 21 fork is going to be in the actual mid valve, which it's that initial touch and also just the ramp up from that very, very high speed type of head. So there's a number of different scenarios on a motocross track where the speeds increase tremendously, and that's an area that the air fork has sometimes been less well liked, let's just say that, than spring forks, because they do tend to have a little bit of a stiffer feel in those scenarios that doesn't contribute to the rider feeling comfortable. So
let's see what you got in the mid valve.
Okay, so that's the big change in the air leg. On the damping cartridge side, the big change, and there are a few others, but the thing that makes the biggest difference is we've gone away from a clamp down setting on the compression side of the mid valve, which would mean that we can now float the compression setting, or in this case it's more of what they call a trampoline design. So if you look at these two pistons, I don't know if you want to maybe zoom in on that and have a look. Basically it's the same basic piston, but you'll notice the one on the left, the model year 21 version, has a counterbore on the surface, and what that allows for is to set up a floating or a trampoline style compression setting. To see what that does in reality, you do need to see what the tap looks like. We call this the tap, and this is where the piston actually is installed, and the compression valving goes underneath and then the rebound on top. You'll notice that machined into that is what we call a cup, and this is basically going to allow the setting to move a little bit down. If I pull the setting out and put it on here, I can show you what that does. You'll notice as well that it's got a 6mm tap, and then it actually increases to an 8mm. So the shim stack on the compression side goes from a 6mm ID shim to an 8mm. This is a system that's not that unusual. It's been done before, but where it's helpful, and getting back to Jay, to your slap downs and other high pressure situations like that on the fork, it's easy for the damping to ramp up too much, and that translates into poor hand feel, a lot of jarring, and not ideal. So what this mid valve does is it allows us to run damping numbers that we like for hold up in the mid and top of the stroke, the control that you're looking for, but then when the suspension speeds up, not to have that spiking. So if I were to put the setting on here, it will make this a lot clearer to people what it's doing. So if you look at this cup, inside there's another edge right there. That edge is below the edge of the cup.
You have to have glasses on to see that.
Yeah.
At least if you're over 50.
So what the trampoline setting does is I take these shims, these are 24 OD shims, and I put them on there, and they're now resting on the edge of this cup, but they are not resting on that lip you see down in the bottom there. And what that is the travel that I have to move the trampoline. I can adjust that with shims depending on the setting, but there's other things I can do as well. Now, when I put the setting itself, the normal tapered shim stack that you see in any valving system like this, these shims can actually bend down, and that adjusts the damping as the speeds change in the fork. But I can also push the whole stack down into that cup, and when that moves down into that cup, it essentially moves the whole stack away. So at very high pressures, instead of seeing a huge spike in damping that is not ideal, this actually allows us to control the damping curve in different ways at different speeds.
So this would go on next.
So then
piston.
So the piston goes on next. I can also adjust preloading for that shim stack,
Right.
to achieve different results there as well.
But in stock, this is like stock form right
Yeah.
here. And how these are moving right now, you didn't get as much movement of those on the 20 version than you're getting with those things you've changed right there.
Correct. So basically, to put it in very simple terms, a shim stack, a traditional tapered shim stack, is bending away from the piston. This still does that, but it has another way that it can move, and that way is that the whole shim stack can move up and down into this cup. So it has multiple ways that it can be adjusted. In essence, I can adjust how much it can move by limiting stroke in that cup. I can also adjust how much preload I have on the setting, because it's important to have a certain amount, and then I can change the setting itself as well as the number of shims in the trampoline portion, which would make it stiffer or softer. It's very adjustable, and again, it's something that has been developed before. It's not a completely new concept, but in this particular application, where it makes a big difference for us is that it can get that plushness that you're looking for in slapdowns. Particularly, that's a good place that you would notice the difference for sure.
That's awesome. Is there anything else you think we should touch on, or do you think we're pretty good?
So obviously, it's a whole new setting in the compression mid valve. There's the changes as well to the base valve setting. Nothing major there, but overall, I would say that looking at how much stuff has changed on the model year 21 forks should give people an idea of just how much WP has invested in improving this design and finding areas where it can still be improved, even though it has been out for more than 5 years. We haven't stopped working on it. We are continuing to find improvements.
I got kind of a funny question for you,
Yep.
because we want to know how much better. So, in your opinion, and the other testers, is this like a 5%, 10% better fork than 20, or what would you guess? Like for you guys riding out the track
Sure.
and testing, what do you guys feel like you've accomplished?
So one of the biggest things that this hardware does for us is it opens up opportunities to adjust the setting in ways that we couldn't before. Now, a lot of times when people will say, hey, is the model year 20 stuff or the model year 21, is it softer or stiffer than the model year 20? Well, it's a question that you can't really answer. And the reason I say that is because, yeah, you might say, okay, it is a little bit stiffer, but it's more about what these hardware changes allow us to do is to adjust how the damping is made. So we might be stiffer in the early part of the stroke, but then get softer as the speeds increase. We had limitations with the system that we were using before that we are now able to overcome.
Okay, so 50% better, you said.
At least 100% better.
So now tomorrow we're taking out a 21
Yep.
FC350.
Sure.
We're going to start with 105 on the rear. Where should we start on our air pressure on the fork?
So on the 350, the specification for model year 21 is 10.6 bar.
Okay.
And we have found that for faster riders, a little more air helps. They're hitting stuff harder. They need a bit more hold up.
So what will they go up to range, you think?
So within range, with that 350, I would say you probably don't really want to go above 10.9, maybe 11 with a very fast guy.
Okay.
But so you're talking about 0.2 of a bar more.
And what's the lowest kind of range you'd recommend to be tested? Because we'll start where you're saying at 10 point. What was it?
10.6 on the 350.
On the 3. And what would you say would be our lowest we'd want to go down to tomorrow when we're testing?
10.6.
So they don't like when we run lower, but I know there's lots of guys watching this that have run lower on their previous forks. So we will try lower, and we're going to try 10.6. The other big thing we noticed back in 17 when we started running these forks was the first thing straight away is we weren't bleeding both sides the first month. We didn't realize you were supposed to bleed, and we figured it out straight away. And so I find a lot of guys aren't bleeding the forks as often as they should. Do you guys come across some of that?
We do. And honestly, if you want a little pro tip, if you're at the motocross track, you got your center stand there, your box stand, go out, check your pressure. Just make sure it's where you think it needs to be. We'll typically set it low in the morning, especially if it's cold or if you're at elevation or some other change like that. But cold temperatures are quite a big thing to worry about. Set your pressure a little bit low, about 0.2 bar. Go out, do a warm-up. Get everything working, your body, your mind, your bike, feel a little bit comfortable, come in, put the bike on the stand. At that time is a really good opportunity to bleed your outer tubes, which is a typical bleed, like even a spring fork, you would do that, and then recheck your pressure. You will always see a little increase as the unit warms up, and on a very hot day like we have right now, it'll actually be something you might want to check a few more times during the day, depending on how serious you want to take it. But temperature obviously changes pressure. This is pretty normal stuff. And then elevation is something you need to maybe watch if you're changing elevation a lot. So
that'll tend to increase and increase what you're having to let out on those air.
But if you warm it up after one little quick warm up moto, put it on the stand. That's a perfect time to check it again.
Okay, Lee. So my first big question is, KTM still and WP is still very invested in the air fork.
Yes.
What are some big reasons why you guys are going that direction?
So obviously we're the last of the air fork crowd. Everyone else went away from it. There are pluses and minuses to air forks. I think as a general rule, people are more familiar with spring forks, and so that is something that we consider. There are benefits, though, to air forks. One of the benefits is that it's an adjustment that people can make, based on rider weight and what type of riding you're doing, that with a traditional spring fork would require purchasing and installing additional springs or parts, and so that's a benefit for us. That's especially important on the minis, where the kids are changing size and speed very quickly, and so that's a benefit. There's also the way that the air fork works. It has a lot of bottoming resistance, which can be a benefit for any rider, and obviously the goal is to overcome any negatives in the air fork that, as a comparison to spring fork, would be something that would stand out to somebody riding both.
Okay, and then my next question is, as far as 21's concerned, what are the big differences between the KTM and the Husqvarna models with the WP forks, especially? Just the forks is really all we're talking about.
Sure. So on the model year 21 Huskies, the forks and actually the whole bike is lowered by 10 millimeters. And in the shock, we're not doing that necessarily with the shock itself. It's changes to linkage and pull rod, along with a small change in the shock to achieve that. In the forks specifically, what they've done is the traditional and easy way to lower a fork is to put spacers inside the cartridge and pull it down and basically just shorten it by however much you want, and that's the normal way to do it. But in this particular instance, what they actually did was, in order to lower the Husky, they shortened the cartridge tubes themselves on both legs, and then they also shortened the outer stanchions by 10 millimeters as well. And the reason for that is because when you shorten a fork by putting spacers inside of it, you actually adjust the distance between the outer bushing, which is inside your chrome tube, and the inner bushing, which is attached to the top of your chrome tube. So when you move that distance between the bushings further apart, it actually gets more rigid. So in order to maintain the same level of flexibility, on the Husqvarna, they actually shortened the outer aluminum tube so that distance is maintained with the lower 10 millimeter lower ride height.
That makes total sense. So now 21 and forward, we're going to need to pay attention if we're swapping forks from a Husky and a KTM. We're going to want to, going forward, pay attention to that.
Yes, that is a real reality, that you won't be able to just switch back and forth.
And I know there's probably a lot involved, but what's the big difference with having a bike that's 10 millimeters shorter and one that's going to be the higher, like the KTM? What do you think you're going to notice? I mean, a short guy like me, it's okay. I'm a little over 3/8 of an inch now, closer to the ground, which is good. But other than that, what else would you notice?
The area where it really makes an improvement for the rider riding the bike, other than being able to reach the ground a little more easily, is in the mid corner. The bike is more stable. So basically, the whole center of gravity of the bike is slightly lower, and it does seem like, if you're talking about 10 millimeters or 3/8 of an inch, not a very big difference, but it is something that you can notice when you're riding the bike.
That's great. Okay, and now I just remembered something. We were talking about air pressure, and when you're running the air forks, you're talking about the kids jumping from, that are growing. One thing I run across, I get guys commenting all the time about what they run I get guys now. I know you guys probably are all thinking bar, right? But in
Yeah.
pressures, they're running like 120, which is lower than what you guys recommend.
Yes.
Okay, 120 up to 145 in that range. And what they'll do, a lot of guys are trail riding with 120, and even some guys lower. But the lowest we trail ride is usually 130. And we're pretty happy trail riding. And then they'll bump it up when they get onto, say, a track or a more
Sure.
open condition. And that's how they're compensating and making, and that's with stock forks. They aren't modified typically. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, it's a bit of a twin-edged sword for us a little bit. We do know that some consumers out there run the pressures a lot lower than we would specify. But we do have different pressures. For instance, on our XC off-road bikes with air forks, we specify a substantially lower air pressure, usually about 1 bar. So
Okay, and we'll translate that
Sure.
to human terms. So because what do you guys recommend mostly for most motocross bikes? 10 point what?
So in the 4-stroke motocross bikes, and actually the 252 stroke too, we're in a range of between 10.5 and 10.89, right around there in bar. Obviously the 125 being the lightest of the fleet, and also typically ridden by younger, smaller riders. That's a little bit off. That's a little bit lower than the others. But when you're talking about in general on the motocross bikes, around 10.5 to 10.9 bar is our range typically.
Because a lot of the guys that run these real low pressures, 120 to 130 in those ranges, they're riding through serious rocks. Softball to bowling ball size.
Yeah.
And that's where it seems to really help, is through those rocks.
For sure. The downside for us is that on the XC bikes, we run a very different rebound setting, which compensates for low air. In other words, it has less damping so that it has better recovery. Now, when you start to run that type of air pressure on a motocross bike that has more rebound damping designed into the setting, it can unfortunately create hold down and problems like that. So we try to educate people that running lower air is a strategy you can use, but there is certainly some downsides on, say, a motocross application to doing that.
Yeah, and we tend to be higher there. And just real quickly, for most motocross applications and off-road, what do you guys recommend sag-wise on these bikes that have linkages?
Sure.
Those.
Yeah. So our sag number that we do all our development work at, and we do use riders that weigh more and less and sit further back and sit further forward. We always aim for 105. Now, a faster rider might take that up to as little as 100 millimeters of sag, but all the development work is always done at around 105.
Okay.
And obviously, we do have a range there, but that's what we're shooting for.
That's what we're shooting for.
Weighed the air fork versus a conversion with a spring fork that WP has. They have a single spring conversion that's set up. You can get those, and there's a few companies that offer the actual WP one. There's some other options out there. So it's around 4.4 pounds heavier than running just the regular air fork. So we weighed them. So that's pretty substantial, and I think we'd probably see similar weight gains with dual spring forks in that range, I would think, because this is one big heavy spring. If you did dual springs, it'd be something in that range. So you're going to be in that range. Now, some people like that heavier fork front end feel. It pushes the front end down, gives them a little more positive feel, especially maybe faster guys like to really feel that front wheel, that real contact. Or I don't mind it being a little floaty. So that's what we're going to hopefully check out more of.
Hey, so we're back here now, and we learned a lot today. Yesterday in the shop, we learned a lot going over these new forks. And today, we played with air pressure more than we've ever done at one time, because we just kind of, I think, always negative, we don't want to spend time messing with it. So some things we've learned is that messing with the air fork while you're out that day does make a big difference. So also, I don't know that you need to run as low pressures as we've tried in the past, like in that 140 range. So we've gone back up to like 150 range and up to the 154. So it was like right at 10.6 to 10.4 bar in that range. And we were a little bit lower than what they were recommending, and that got rid of a little bit of that harshness. But when you go too low in the pressure, like 140, we notice the front gets very wallowy and a little bouncy, which is great when you go those low pressures. It's great on trail riding in rocks and everything. I think that's why it's good in those really low pressures on trail riding. But on the track, you don't have any feel of the front wheel. It's just drifting all over the place. So that's one thing I noticed with the lower pressures. So the next thing is this bike feels amazing. So the 2021 bike is great. Again, thanks to Swap Moto for letting us borrow this bike. The bike is amazing. The forks feel great. Like I'm saying, so my thought is, compared to Yamaha forks, are they better? And I think they're probably better for most vet guys, for the reason that you can tune them a lot more and get them right where you need. Where the stock Yamaha forks, if you need to, you're gonna have to get them revalved if you want to make any big changes. So that's one really big advantage, is you have a lot more tunability at the track with these forks. It is more of a hassle. You need to bleed spring forks as well. So keeping them bled is critical. And then checking your pressure. The pressure's straight away, when we had the pressure set yesterday at our shop and then went and rode it, they went up 4 or 5 pounds first in 2 laps. We came in, did 2 laps, came in, and they had for sure gone up. It definitely spiked up, at least 5 pound range, easy. So that's something you want to check straight away your first moto. And if you stay out for a whole day where it's getting hotter, you're gonna want to check it during the day. So it is more hassle that way. But this fork, I think, makes this bike great. And I think this 350 is probably the best bike for so many guys. If you're not actively racing where you need to get hole shots against 450s, you're just riding, having fun, I think this 21 350 is just amazing. And again, we like the XCF version. We had that bike out here today too, which would be the FC version or FX version in the Husky. We had one of those out today, the KTM version, and felt great on that thing. A bike we ride a lot. That one has the air fork that's done by FC, and that bike is really good as well. And we went back up on the fork pressure on that bike, and it did feel a lot better as well. So we're getting those pressures back up and not running them drastically low like we do maybe when we're trail riding to give us that huge plushness over the rocks. So amazing bike, amazing time. We learned a lot on this fork settings, and what the changes they made for 21 really look like they work. And I think if you're looking at getting a 21 KTM or Husqvarna, I think you're going to be, you're not going to do any wrong by getting one of these bikes. They're amazing. So hopefully you enjoy. We'll check you out at the track or trail soon.